Picture a room lit by a single high window. A monk sits bent over a wooden desk, a knife in one hand to scrape mistakes, a quill in the other. Outside, bells mark the hours of prayer. Inside, there is only the scratch of a nib on stretched animal skin. This is the image people carry of the Scriptorium: quiet devotion, patient faith, work done for God rather than for money. Here is what that image leaves out. The room you are picturing is a manufacturing floor. The skin under the monk's hand came from an animal raised, slaughtered, and processed specifically for this purpose, and a single large book could consume the hides of an entire herd. The man writing on it might spend 15 months producing one copy, working from before dawn until the light failed, 6 days a week. The finished object could be worth as much as a house, and the person who commissioned it was not paying for paper and ink. He was paying almost entirely for time. That is the paradox this video is built around. A medieval book looks like it should be expensive because animal skin was scarce. It was not. It was expensive because human skill was scarce, and for nearly 1,000 years there was no way to multiply a skilled hand. Then, in the middle of the 15th century, someone found a way to multiply it, and the entire economic machine that had powered the scriptorium for centuries came apart in the space of 2 generations. By the end, the man who built the machine that broke it walked away with almost nothing, and the men who financed it walked away with everything. Understanding why tells you something that still applies every time a slow, skill-based industry meets a machine that can copy what only a trained hand used to do. Start with what a patron in the 13th or 14th century was actually buying when he commissioned a book, because it was never just a book. It was a bundle of 4 different things, and each one had its own price tag, even if the invoice never separated them. The first thing he was buying was material: skin. Specifically, the treated hide of a calf, sheep, or goat, cleaned, limed, stretched on a frame, and scraped down until it could hold ink without bleeding. This was called parchment, and its finest grade made from very young calves was called vellum. A modest personal prayer book might need a few dozen skins. A large liturgical Bible, the kind kept on an altar and read aloud to a congregation, was a different order of magnitude entirely. Historians estimate that a full parchment Bible required somewhere in the range of 200 hides of goat or sheep, or around 60 hides of cattle, depending on the animals used and the size of the pages. The Codex Amiatinus, an enormous 8th century Bible produced in Northumbria, is believed to have consumed the skins of more than 1,000 animals. The largest surviving medieval manuscript, the so-called Devil's Bible, is thought to have used the hides of 160 donkeys. When Johannes Gutenberg printed his famous Bible on vellum in the 1450s, each of the roughly 35 vellum copies required around 170 calfskins. Multiply that across the print run, and you are looking at close to 6,000 calves consumed for one edition of one book. So yes, the animal cost was real, and it was significant. And if you only looked at that number, you would walk away thinking the scriptorium's economics were essentially a livestock business wearing a monk's robe. This is where most explanations of medieval book prices stop. It is also where they get the story wrong. Here's where it gets interesting. A detailed study of manuscript production records from Peterhouse College, Cambridge, going through account books from the 15th century, broke down exactly where the money in a finished book actually went. Materials, including the parchment, ink, and binding, accounted for about 17% of the total cost. Labor accounted for the other 83%. 83 cents of every dollar spent on a medieval book paid for time, not skin. That number should reframe everything you think you know about why these books were expensive. The Scriptorium was not fundamentally a leather workshop. It was a labor-intensive manufacturing operation whose single scarcest input was trained human attention, sustained for months at a time, without error. Now walk through what that attention actually cost, because the number gets larger the more carefully you look at it. A single skilled scribe, copying a large liturgical Bible by hand, needed roughly 15 months of steady work, not 15 months of occasional effort. 15 months of daily labor, from the morning bell to the evening one, with a break for a midday meal, maintaining consistent letter height and line spacing across hundreds of pages. Because a manuscript with wandering, uneven script was considered a lesser product and commanded a lower price. A large monastic scriptorium might house as many as 40 scribes at once, but a single elaborate book was typically the responsibility of one or two hands from start to finish, because consistency mattered more than speed. And the scribe was only the beginning. After the text was copied, the pages often went to an illuminator, a separate craftsman trained to add decorated capital letters, marginal illustrations, and sometimes gold leaf. Illumination was its own specialized trade with its own long apprenticeship, and gilding a page well took real technical skill, since gold leaf is unforgiving of a shaking hand. After illumination, the pages went to a binder, who sewed the gathered sheets, attached wooden boards, and covered them in leather, or, for the grandest commissions, metal and jewels. A single high-status commission could pass through the hands of a parchment maker, one or two scribes, an illuminator, and a binder, each paid separately, each adding weeks or months to the total production time. Add all of this up and you can see why, when Gutenberg's press finally produced printed Bibles in the 1450s, the vellum copies sold for around 30 florins each, while a skilled craftsman in the same period might earn something like 20 to 25 florins in an entire year. A single Bible cost more than a year of a trained professional's income, and that was already the cheaper, mechanically produced version. A fully hand-copied, hand-illuminated Bible from a century earlier could run considerably higher. One historian of the period has put it plainly: a single hand-copied book in the 14th century could be worth as much as a house. This is the first real reversal. The public image is that medieval books were priced like jewelry, valuable because the raw material, animal skin, was rare and precious. The economic reality is that they were priced like a custom-built ship or a hand-tailored suit of armor. Expensive because an enormous quantity of specialized, non-transferable human time went into producing exactly one unit, and that time could not be sped up, stored, or mass-produced. The Scriptorium was not selling skins. It was selling months. That single fact explains almost everything else about how the business behaved, starting with who could actually afford to be a customer. If 80% of the cost is labor, and labor cannot be discounted the way materials sometimes can, then a scriptorium has almost no room to serve a mass market, because there is no version of the product that is meaningfully cheaper. A patron either commissioned an expensive book, or he did not commission a book at all. There was no middle tier the way there is with almost every modern manufactured good, where a basic version and a premium version share the same factory line at wildly different price points. Every manuscript required close to the same number of scribe hours per page, no matter who was buying it, which meant the customer base for anything beyond the simplest texts was, by necessity, kings, bishops, wealthy monasteries, and the handful of merchant families rich enough to behave like nobility. The product's cost structure did the market segmentation for you, automatically, whether anyone intended it to or not. This also explains why monasteries, rather than independent craftsmen, dominated book production for so long. A monastery already had the one resource that made the economic survivable: a captive, unpaid labor pool. Monks did not need a year's wages to justify 15 months at a writing desk, because their food, shelter, and purpose were already provided by the institution itself. In economic terms, the monastery had converted a devastating labor cost into a fixed cost it was already paying for other reasons. This is not cynicism about faith. It is simply the reason monastic scriptoria could absorb a cost structure that would have bankrupted almost any secular workshop trying to pay market wages for the same 15 months of work. But by the 13th and 14th centuries, something had started to shift. Universities were multiplying across Europe, cities were growing, and a new class of buyer had emerged: literate laypeople, lawyers, merchants, and university students who wanted books but were not connected to a monastery's free labor pool. To serve them, secular scribes and professional stationers set up shop in cities like Paris and Oxford, paying real wages to real workers. which meant they felt the full weight of that 83% labor cost with no institutional cushion underneath it. These were businesses in the fullest sense, vulnerable to exactly the kind of shock that hits any labor-intensive operation when the price of labor itself moves. That shock arrived in the middle of the 14th century, and it did not come from the book trade at all. It came from the Black Death. Here is the failure chain, and it runs through several links before it reaches the point most people assume is the real story. The plague swept through Europe starting in 1348, killing something on the order of a third to half of the population in many regions. Skilled labor of every kind became suddenly, brutally scarce, because skilled labor takes years to train, and the people who had that training were dying in enormous numbers. Scribes, illuminators, and binders were no exception. Surviving craftsmen could suddenly demand far higher wages because demand for their specific, hard-to-replace skill had not fallen nearly as much as the supply of people able to provide it. Those higher wages flowed directly into book prices, since labor was already 83% of the cost. Book prices, which had already been high, went higher still, right at the moment when a new secular market of merchants and university students was trying to expand. At the same time, a second force was quietly working against parchment from a completely different direction. Paper, invented centuries earlier in China, had traveled through the Islamic world and reached Spain and Italy by the 12th century, where water-powered paper mills began producing it in real volume by the 13th and 14th centuries. Paper was less durable than parchment and harder to illuminate well, but it was dramatically cheaper to make, since it did not require raising and slaughtering an animal for every few pages. Buyers who did not need a document to survive for 500 years, students copying lecture notes, merchants keeping accounts, clerics drafting sermons, began shifting to paper wherever permanence did not matter. Parchment retreated to the applications where status and durability justified its cost. Altar Bibles, royal charters, and other objects meant to display wealth as much as convey text. So, by the early 15th century, the Scriptorium system was already under pressure from two directions at once. Its core cost, skilled labor, had gotten more expensive because of a demographic catastrophe. Its core material, parchment, was losing ground to a cheaper substitute wherever the buyer did not need to display status. The business was being squeezed from both the cost side and the low end of the market simultaneously. What it did not yet face was a threat to the one thing it still had a monopoly on: the actual writing. That changed in the German city of Mainz, sometime around 1440, when a goldsmith and engineer named Johannes Gutenberg began experimenting with a way to cast individual metal letters that could be arranged, inked, pressed onto a page, and then rearranged to print an entirely different page. It took him roughly a decade and a half of secretive, expensive tinkering to get the process to work reliably at scale, and by the early 1450s he was ready to print the most ambitious book anyone had yet attempted with the new technology. A full Latin Bible, 42 lines to a page, designed to look as closely as movable type could manage, like the finest hand-copied manuscripts it was meant to replace. Here's the number that makes the disruption concrete. A trained scribe working by hand could produce something in the neighborhood of 40 pages of finished text in a day under ideal conditions. Gutenberg's press, once running, could produce roughly 3,600 impressions in the same span. That is close to a 90-fold increase in output per day of labor. 83% of a book's cost had always been the time it took one skilled hand to write it out. The press did not make parchment cheaper. It made the scarcest input in the entire industry, scribal time, almost irrelevant. You would expect this to have made Gutenberg enormously wealthy. It did not, and the reason why is the case study that makes this entire mechanism impossible to forget. Printing at the scale Gutenberg envisioned required serious capital before it produced a single florin of revenue. Metal for the type, a functioning press, paper, and vellum in bulk, ink formulated to work on metal type rather than a quill, and wages for a workshop of skilled assistants, all paid out over years before the finished Bibles could be sold. Gutenberg did not have that capital himself, So around 1448, he borrowed it from a Mainz goldsmith and moneylender named Johann Fust, who advanced him roughly 800 guilders to build the equipment, and then a few years later, another 800 guilders to fund what the surviving legal record calls simply the work of the books. Fust's money was the entire foundation the Bible Project was built on. The Bible was nearly finished, printed in an edition of somewhere around 180 copies, when Fust did something that determined the rest of both men's lives. In 1455, before the last copies had even been bound and sold, Fust sued Gutenberg in a Mainz court, demanding immediate repayment in full, with interest of both loans, more than 2,000 guilders in total. Gutenberg argued that much of the money had been an investment in their shared profit, rather than a straightforward loan requiring repayment on demand. The court disagreed. Gutenberg lost. He forfeited his presses, his type, his workshop, and effectively his entire printing operation at the exact moment his invention was about to prove itself to the world. Fust did not simply walk away with the equipment, he also walked away with the man who best understood how to run it. Peter Schoeffer, who had trained as a professional scribe in Paris before becoming Gutenberg's most skilled craftsman, and had served as a witness for Fust during the lawsuit, joined Fust in a new printing partnership immediately after the case concluded. Together, Fust and Schoeffer produced some of the most technically refined books of the entire early printing era, and within 2 years, Schoeffer had married Fust's daughter, folding the workshop's most valuable remaining talent directly into the family that now controlled the capital and the equipment. Gutenberg continued working in printing for the rest of his life, but never again at the scale or with the resources he had commanded before the lawsuit. And he died in 1468 with comparatively little to show for having invented one of the most consequential technologies in human history. Fust and Schoeffer's firm, meanwhile, became the first commercially successful printing house in Europe, publishing the celebrated Mainz Psalter and going on to produce Bibles, law books, and classical texts that made the new medium's reputation. Notice exactly what happened here, because it is a pattern that shows up again and again whenever a capital-intensive technology disrupts a skill-intensive one. The person who solved the technical problem, who spent a decade and a half figuring out how to cast type and build a reliable press, was not the person who ended up owning the result. The person who supplied the capital that made the technical solution possible was the one who ended up owning it, because the legal and financial structure of the partnership, not the invention itself, determined who kept the asset when the relationship broke down. And the craftsman who actually knew how to operate the machine at a professional level, Schoeffer, was valuable enough that the capital holder made sure to secure his loyalty permanently, through marriage as much as through wages. This is the second reversal buried inside the first one. The public story of printing is that Gutenberg's invention destroyed the old, expensive hand-copied book business and made reading affordable for everyone. That is true eventually, but it took decades, not years, for prices to fall to where ordinary people could participate. And Gutenberg himself never saw the payoff. The real economic story is not invention versus tradition. It is capital versus labor, playing out identically whether the labor in question belongs to a monk with a quill or an inventor with a printing press. Follow the effect on the wider industry, because the printing press did not simply put Scriptoria out of business overnight. Books stayed expensive for a generation after Gutenberg, since early printers still needed enormous upfront capital, still bought vellum for their finest editions, and still relied on illuminators to hand-paint decorated initials into printed pages. A hybrid product that tried to have it both ways during the transition. What print did immediately was collapse the economics of the 83%, the scribal labor. Once labor stopped being the bottleneck, publishers could compete on volume in a way no scriptorium ever could, printing hundreds or thousands of identical copies from the same set type, spreading the fixed cost of preparing that type across every unit sold. Before 1450, historians estimate all of Europe held something on the order of 30,000 books in total. By 1500, that number had risen into the range of 10 to 12 million. The bottleneck that had defined the entire industry for 1,000 years, the finite number of trained hands and the finite number of hours in each of those hands' working lives, had simply stopped applying. For the monasteries, this arrived as a slow-motion collapse rather than a single dramatic event. A scriptorium's entire competitive advantage had rested on possessing patient, disciplined, literate labor that did not need to be paid a living wage. That advantage meant nothing once a press could outproduce 40 scribes working simultaneously at a fraction of the marginal cost per copy, using labor that did not need years of calligraphic training to operate a keyboard of movable type. Monastic scriptoria did not vanish immediately, and for luxury commissions, ceremonial charters, and objects meant to display wealth rather than transmit information cheaply, hand production on fine vellum persisted for generations. But as a mainstream method of producing the books that a growing, literate, secular population actually wanted to read, the scriptorium's economic reason for existing had been removed within roughly 2 generations of Gutenberg's press going into operation. Step back and look at who ended up on which side of this transition, because the pattern is not random. The monasteries that had built their book economics entirely around unpaid, devoted labor found that model suddenly obsolete, since the thing they had an abundance of, patient hands, was no longer the scarce resource. Capital and mechanical infrastructure were. The individual scribes who had spent years mastering calligraphy found a skill that had commanded a year's wages for one book was now worth a fraction of that. Since the press did not need beautiful handwriting, it needed operators who could set type accurately. The capital holders, men like Fust, who had money to invest in equipment rather than years to invest in penmanship, captured a disproportionate share of the new value the technology created, precisely because ownership of the physical press, not skill in using a quill, was now the asset that mattered. And the class of buyer expanded dramatically from kings and bishops to merchants, lawyers, students, and eventually ordinary literate townspeople, because the product they were buying had stopped being priced primarily on human time and started being priced on paper, ink, and the fixed cost of type divided across an ever-growing print run. This is why the Scriptorium makes such a clean case study for a much broader economic mechanism, one that has nothing to do with monks or manuscripts specifically. Any business whose value proposition rests on scarce, highly trained human time is vulnerable the moment a technology arrives that can substitute for that time at even a fraction of the output. It does not matter whether the trained hand is holding a quill, a scalpel, a paintbrush, or a keyboard. The moment 83% of your cost structure can be replaced by a machine running 90 times faster, the entire economics of the business gets rewritten, and the rewriting almost never favors the people whose skill used to be the scarce input. It favors whoever owns the machine and whoever had the capital to build it in the first place. Gutenberg had the skill, Fust had the capital. History remembers Gutenberg's name on the invention. The money, at the time, went to Fust. So go back to that monk bent over his desk in the high, quiet room. He was never simply performing an act of devotion, and the book taking shape under his hands was never simply a religious object. It was the output of one of the most labor-intensive manufacturing processes in medieval Europe. A process where 83 cents of every unit of value came from months of irreplaceable human time, which is exactly why it could not survive the arrival of a machine that made that time replaceable. The parchment was never the expensive part. The skins were a cost, sometimes a very large one, but they were never the reason a book could be worth a house. The scribes' 15 months were the reason. And when a press in Mainz cut 15 months down to a matter of days, it was not the animals, and it was not even the scribes, who determined who profited from what came next. It was whoever held the note on the equipment when the money ran out.